Thank you for staying with us for our last session of today. The two individuals who have just joined our panel here, you're seeing for the first time. In dead center, Gil Vazquez, who is a DJ in New York City who specializes in 70s, 80s, and 90s hip-hop and dance music. He met Keith Haring at age 18 in 1988 and became a close friend and traveled extensively with him during the last 2 years of his life. Gil has served as vice president of the Haring Foundation for 2 decades and is currently its president. As such, he plays a pivotal role in the foundation's effort to preserve, promote, and advance Haring's legacy. Since 1990, the Haring Foundation has donated millions of dollars to causes related to the AIDS virus, children, and the arts, and Gil continues to help advance the foundation's mission today. So please join me in welcoming Gil Vazquez. And to my immediate left is Fred Braithwaite, more popularly known as Fab Five Freddy, who is an American hip-hop pioneer, filmmaker, and visual artist. He emerged in New York's downtown underground scene in the late 1970s as a camera operator and regular guest on Glenn O'Brien's public access cable show, TV Party. In 1981, he was immortalized in pop culture when he was name-checked by Deborah Harry in her hit song, Rapture, and the line was, "Fab Five Freddy told me everybody's fly." So, like many creative figures from the New York downtown scene in that period, Freddy explored a range of media and modes of creative expression. In 1982, he produced and starred in Wild Style, which you heard Jane talking about earlier on this morning, which was a groundbreaking feature-length film about hip-hop by the director Charlie Ahern, for which he also composed all the original music. Fred was also one of the first graffiti artists to exhibit his work internationally and was very close friends with Jean-Michel Basquiat, Haring, of course, and Futura 2000. He played a leading role in introducing New York graffiti to the mainstream art world. The visual arts remain a focus of his life today, and as recently as 2011, his work was included in the MoCA LA exhibition Art in the Streets, which was an ambitious, wide-ranging historical survey of graffiti and street art organized by Jeffrey Deitch. Fred has directed dozens of music videos and commercials for artists such as Queen Latifah, Nas, and Snoop Dogg, and he continues to maintain a very active career in media and film. So please join me in welcoming Fab Five Freddy. So maybe to begin, can you hear me? Oh, good. Yeah. Maybe to begin this panel, I'd like to ask you, Gil, because you met Keith at a very young age in 88. I guess he had already received his diagnosis. You traveled extensively with him throughout Europe. Can you just share some recollections of the impact that he made on your life?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I mean, first I'd like to just get into a little bit of how we met. The first time I met Keith Haring, I was working at a T-shirt store on Broadway, not too far from his studio, and he walks in, and he's looking for somebody who worked there named Kevin. Now he's dressed. I mean, it's like summer. He has on this red Michael Jackson jacket with a bunch of zippers and a bunch of signatures on it, and just looked so like unusual to me. What? Like, what is this guy wearing? So he comes in and he asks for Kevin, and I'm like, no, Kevin's not here. And then when Kevin did come in the next day, I said to him, I think Keith Haring was here looking for you. Now, in the back, like, I didn't know, I knew the subway drawings. My extent of knowledge as far as Keith Haring was concerned was the subway drawings and an Adidas campaign that he had done with Run DMC. So that was kind of my point of reference. I didn't know much else about him. But Kevin came in, he's like, yeah, he's a good friend of mine. Do you want to meet him? we arranged a meeting, and the very next day, we were at the studio, and my first encounter with Keith Haring, he was pounding nails and tacks into a portrait of the Mona Lisa that he had bought on the street, and that was my introduction to Keith Haring. And I was, again, it was very intriguing because I'm all of 18 years old, you know, from Harlem. You know, I know nothing about the art world. You know, I maybe had been at this job for, you know, I don't know, a month or so. And here I am meeting this guy in this huge loft, huge art space, and works of art everywhere. And he's pounding nails into the Mona Lisa. That alone made a real impact on me. I kind of knew then that I wanted to know this person better.
And I mean, during that time you traveled with him, I mean, he was having to manage this illness, his AIDS virus. I mean, can you talk about that a little bit?
Correct, yeah. So, you know, in the early time that I met him, I didn't know he was sick. When I did find out, I became very keenly aware that I had to try to recall or try to remember everything. I had to try to remember the places, you know, the names. You know, the whole thing was an education. I mean, I'd never left the country before I met him. You know, all this art that I was being introduced to, and all these, you know, these different experiences and different people. So it was. I became very keenly aware that I had to. It was my responsibility to remember a lot. When he asked me to be a part of this foundation that he wanted to have go on beyond him, I took it extremely seriously. For someone, again, you know, 19, 20 years old, you know, it was 19 really. I had no idea what that would entail. I knew that he was a dear, dear friend, and I would do anything that I could to help further his legacy.
And I mean, to Dieter's, just coming back to Dieter's earlier conversation with Judah, you've been part of that, the power, if you like, of the foundation over 20 years. So can you just say a little bit about that side of you know, the post-Keith experience you've had with the foundation, the kinds of things you've done? Yeah,
it's interesting because, you know, he was such a dynamic person. Whenever he walked into a room, the room was lit. It was lit up. So to now continue his legacy and to further his work without him actually being there was a very daunting challenge. You know, he kind of was a very clear-minded individual. He was very, you know, I want to do this, I don't want to do this, I believe in this, I don't believe in this. And now we had to kind of play it by ear. I mean, we all kind of knew him, and we kind of knew more or less what he would have wanted. But to say for sure, when somebody's not there, what they would do and what they wouldn't do was very challenging. Nobody knew how to run a foundation. This is the first time we had been thrust into that role. So it was all, you know, we all kind of flew by the seat of our pants early on. And once we got our legs, we kind of got a sense of what we should be doing and what we thought he would be doing, and did our best to kind of align what we were doing with what he may have done. And knock wood, you know, 20 odd years later, I think his legacy has been furthered, and hopefully will continue to go in that direction.
Thank you, Gil. Just one more question for you before we move on. Dieter mentioned this earlier on in his talk, and you shared it with a few of us in the galleries, the you saw him create The Great White Way and The Prophets of Rage. Could you maybe just share briefly that anecdote with this larger audience?
Certainly.
Because I think it's powerful.
I think that The Great White Way was one of those works that Keith wanted to get off his chest. I think the theme of nuclear proliferation, war, greed, money, those are pretty constant themes throughout his work. And I think The Great White Way was kind of like the finale of that, and it was kind of to show the who. The who is responsible. Obviously, he did not make that. It's considered difficult work. It's not an easy sell to have a gigantic pink phallus in your living room or whatever or what have you. Mm. But that was certainly not the purpose of it. I think he wanted to kind of spell out the who, and also I think in it there's a bit of somewhat of an acknowledgement or something like that he was also a beneficiary of the Great White Way. Mm. Whereas his success, he succeeded in ways that many of his peers didn't because they were not of that world. Mm.
And one of the little footnotes to that, but important, and this is sort of moving over to Fred now, is that Gil shared the fact that that painting was created against the backdrop of Public Enemy music. So I wanted to ask you, Fred, about the power of music in Keith Haring's life, and obviously that's a big part of your background. So if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, well, I guess music, all of us at that time enjoyed music, as people have often done, but particularly as young people that were focused primarily at that time on making paintings and being artists, we also enjoyed hanging out, and wide range of music going on at that time in New York City in the downtown scene. You had new wave, you had punk, and I was this guy that kind of was informing people about a new kind of music, a new culture, which we now know of as hip hop, that was happening in the upper reaches of the city. And when Keith and I became friends, once again, hanging out at clubs was something that we all did, and we'd oftentimes find ourselves talking about music that DJs were playing that we didn't really like. We'd be like, man, I wish they'd play this, I wish they'd play that. And so when that would happen, you'd realize that you had things in common about being open to different sounds and Keith was very open to different sounds, and so we'd hip each other to different things and records that we liked, music that we liked. We'd run out to the dance floor to shake it, and that was great about Keith, and a lot of the friends I would meet at that time just being open. And I remember there was a guy in the Bronx who was known as the master of records, and I'd be telling Keith and friends that I was meeting downtown that were interested about this new type of culture, this new music. And I told Keith about this guy, Africa Bambaataa, who had been a big gang leader in the Bronx in the 70s and had the great idea to stop, this gangbanging thing and turned the gang that he was the head of into sort of a cultural organization called the Zulu Nation. And Keith wasn't really happening as an artist yet. It was kind of the beginning of it all for a lot of us. So Keith's crew hung out at a little small club. Well, really, it was like the basement of a church on St. Mark's Place called Club 57. 57 was the address of the club. So Keith was like, man, Fred, you think this Africa Bambaataa guy would want to come and play for us? And I was like, that's interesting. I'll reach out to him. And I called Africa Bambaataa up in the Bronx, and I said, hey, listen, Bam, I'm doing this stuff. I was also working on Wild Style at the time with Charlie Ahern, Jane's husband, and so I was meeting all these guys that were the key players, and brought Africa Bambaataa down to Club 57, and it would it would inspire him to go make a record called Planet Rock. Just being exposed to this other audience, and he can pull out his Monkees records and his Kraftwerk and other records that might not go over so well in the Bronx. So that was fun to see that happen and the spark.
How about dance? You know, just the physical form of dance. We've heard Julia talking about classical dance in her own background, and Dita has talked very eloquently about dancing figures in the work itself. And I know you were very close with the Rocksteady crew and so forth. Can you talk about dance in Keith Haring's sort of life and art?
Yeah, well, a part of the hip-hop culture and a part of the idea I had that I shared, and then Charlie and I combined to help put a frame around these ideas, was that there was not just this music, which we know of as hip-hop music. There was a form of dance, which was breakdancing or b-boying, and there was, you know, the kind of painting that was going on at the time that I had been a part of, graffiti painting, and the whole idea of DJing and cutting and scratching was all one thing. So Keith was very open and wanted to see this because you couldn't see it anywhere else. So in the course of working on the movie, Charlie Ahern and I had met key players that we were scouting to feature in this film, and the Rocksteady crew. In fact, breakdancing had kind of ended in the city, and the Rocksteady crew were young, aspiring graffiti artists, but they knew how to breakdance. So we were like, hey, man, you know, they were little events were happening in different places in the downtown Manhattan area. And I remember Futura 2000 and I shared a studio space on 2nd Street and Avenue B. And we gave this impromptu party with no music. We were just hand clapping. And the Rocksteady all showed up, and Keith and Kenny and a bunch of our friends were there. I think Jean-Michel was there. And then we had this crazy hand clap beat going, and the Rocksteady was just breakdancing, and Keith was just, everybody was amazed. Whenever you'd see these guys at the time just do what they did, it was unbelievable. It was gymnastic, it was just rhythmic, it was exciting. And I remember Keith just going, man, this is amazing. And you know, we would go back and forth to each other's studios checking out what we were painting. And I remember going to Keith's studio not long after that, and there were these characters that were clearly inspired by breakdancing. And so it was great to see the inspiration make its way into the work.
Yeah. One of the themes I keep hearing from the various presenters is the theme of collaboration. And Jane, coming back to you and collaborative projects, collab as you refer to it. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that came to be, first and foremost, and then how just describe a little bit more the nature of their collaboration on various projects.
Collaborative Projects was an organization that came into being in, I think, 78. And it was, the core were people who had been, many had gone to the Whitney program, and they were somewhat formalizing what had already been going on. It was coming out of happenings that had been in artist events in the earlier 70s, and it was also in reaction to the creation of the New York State Council for the Arts, which had just started to give, for a few years had been giving artist grants, and they were going to organizations like Artist Space that would then give very small ones to artists, like $200 to do a public project. And my friends said, well, what if we call ourselves an organization, and then we can apply for funding, and we can spend all the money on art projects. And that's what Collab did. Some people had administrative skills, some people were more, there were critics in it. Edith Diak was an early member, and Walter Robinson, who was a critic. And there was no criteria for membership. All you had to do to be a member was to show up at a meeting. I think to vote, supposedly you had to have attended 3 meetings. So because there was a very small amount of money, but there was, I don't know, some years we get $5,000, it was enough that 40 people would show up and fight about how that money should be spent, which in retrospect made for great art, because there was the video contingent who said painting is dead, let's spend all the money on video equipment. Yeah. And then there'd be all sorts of fights about whose turn it was to have the equipment or who broke the equipment and was responsible for fixing it. And space was cheap in New York in those days. People had huge lofts, and we would do shows in different people's spaces. But it was not, the tendency of art groups is for, and I suppose in all groups, is for people who are similar, have similar outlooks to gather together. And this was a group which did not necessarily have similar outlooks. I mean, one of the continuing projects from collaborative projects is Bomb Magazine, which is, Betsy Sussler does it to this day. It was one of the last projects that Collab funded. She came in and said, I think we should do a magazine. A few people had done X Magazine and Avalanche Magazine, so there had been a tradition of it, but you know, she was like, I want to continue this dialogue on the page, and we gave her seed money to start that. And you know, so sometimes I've done interviews with, I'll find an artist I think is interesting and I call Betsy, and sometimes she says yes and sometimes she says no. She's not going to go, oh, you're my old friend, whatever you want. She's like, really? Convince me. And there have been a couple of times where I said, you should, you know, I want to interview John Miller, it's his moment. And then she's like, great, and I'm going to have Liam Gillick do that interview. And I'm like, damn, Betsy. She goes, he knows John better than you do. And I'm like, you know, so it always was a fractious meritocracy, and it, you know, and the art world is a fractious meritocracy. It helps to know people, but you know, you have to step up to the plate and deliver.
Did the Times Square show of 1980 grow out of Collab too? I mean, that's sort of
Yes.
the seed for that.
Yes,
Okay.
it was a Collab project.
Yeah. And for you, Freddie, I know that you were involved in that and, you know, met many of the sort of larger expanding circle of artists. I mean, how did you come to, you know, get there? Because it wasn't necessarily your part of town, was it?
Well, yes, and yes, it was in my part of town. It was Midtown, which was, you know, Times Square. So, hence where all of us would go to see kung fu, horror, and blaxploitation movies really cheaply on 42nd Street, which we call 40 Deuce. So it was definitely my part of town. But what had happened was, it was the front page of the Village Voice one day, 1980, was this photo of this artist. Actually, it's Charlie Ahern's twin brother with one of his sculptures, and the headline was the first radical art show of the 80s. And I was like, wow, look at this. And it was incredibly exciting. I think Richard Goldstein wrote the article, and it was like this whole thing about this art exhibit in a massage parlor, but a massage parlor actually was a whorehouse. At the time is what they were known as. And I said, man, this sounds like a really cool show. So I need to be a part of this. And then there was a guy about town on the downtown scene. His name was Diego Cortez, who was sort of like a new wave punk rock curator, if you will. And I had recently met Diego, and you know, I had me and Lee Quinones had a show in Rome about, we were first graffiti guys that had, you know, really spray painted and rode on trains to, you know, I figured out, look, I want to be an artist, and I hooked up with Lee. Anyway, we had this big show in Rome, so we were beginning to get a little buzz, and we're trying to make moves, and I met Diego, was very excited. Diego said, well, listen, they're having a series of openings, and you should come to the Times Square show. And I go to the Times Square show, and it was really exciting. It was people everywhere. There was art on every square inch of the space, the floor, the ceiling, the toilets. And it was interesting for me because I met Charlie Ahern at the Times Square show and discussed the ideas that would become the movie Wild Style. And then when they realized who I was, they said, man, well, would you like to be in the show? I said, oh, yes, I'd like to be in the show. So they got me some paint, and Lee and I did some spray painting outside of the building as a Fab Five. And then they said, here's a room and you could hang some paintings. Because there were rooms all over this building. It was like a 4-story building, the basement, everywhere was art. But here was some space still available. So I brought these 2 paintings up that I hung in the room, and Lee had helped me hang the painting. You know, we just stapled the canvas to the wall. I think I did some tags, wrote some statements around the work. And then this guy comes in the room. I'm standing there, me and Lee, we say, yeah, these pieces look good. So this guy comes in the room, and he looks at the pieces, and he comes over to me and Lee. He says, you know, you should know about the guys that made this work, Fred and Lee from the Fab Five. And we were like, is this a joke? And he's standing there telling us, and then John Ahern walks into the room. He says, well, Fred, how do you like the paintings? Do you like the way they're hung? I said, and then the guy who had said that to me looked at me and looked at the work, and it was Keith Haring. And Keith was like, oh man, let me take my foot out of my mouth. I can't believe I just did that. I didn't even know who we were. And that's how Keith and I met. We became good buddies from that point on. And so Times Square show was a good show, you guys. Sorry you missed it.
I have a question for Dieter, actually, Jay, if you don't mind just passing the mic over. Dieter, you're a classically trained art historian, and you know the mind behind this exhibition that we're so happy to present here. How is it to sort of hear this history being sort of discussed in an oral history manner now? I mean, how does it thread into the scholarship that you have been thinking about and you continue to think about? I mean, 2 shows with Basquiat coming up next year. Can you talk a little bit about the continuing evolution of that scholarship?
I mean, what I'm always doing, to cut it short, is I'm always looking at the works first. And when you look at the works first, you form a certain idea. And then I'm kind of checking out the literature about what other people said, and then I start to listen to oral history, meaning like in case of Basquiat, I've met many of his friends, not just before I did the show at Baile 4 years ago and Paris, but and it's a process that never ends for me, so it always adds and it always keeps going, and the same for Keith Haring. And so that's a normal approach to test also your ideas with the reality of how it was. And so my feeling is that up to now it goes very well with the idea of the show here. And I'm just always very happy to learn.
Just a follow-up question, really for you, Dieter, but I'd love anybody else in the group here to respond to it. But I'll start with you because it's sort of germane to the world that you operate in. So this is a quote from Keith Haring from his journals, October the 2nd, 1987. The art market is one of the most dangerous, parasitic, corrupt organizations in the world, next to the Roman Catholic Church or the justice system in the United States. So, comment.
Yeah. First of all, I'm happy I'm not an art dealer.
Yes.
So that's the first point. The second point is that it didn't become better during the last years. But of course, the art market is just an organic part of the art scene. Without the art market, no artist could sustain. So it's just something like this self-feeding monster. Haring painted in '85, belonging today to the Broad Foundation, where kind of you are part of it, everybody's part of it, and it's part of the cycle, how bad it is and how good it is.
Yeah. What about the sort of personal inner conflict, if you like, that he carried? It's clear in his journals, he writes about it. I mean, do any of you have any comments about that aspect?
Well, you know, Keith was, very much about, we were aware as young artists about wrongs that had been done to certain artists, like Rothko and this situation that had happened at the Marlborough Gallery. And so basically, he was an abstract expression artist that had died, and there were many works that had been taken advantage of. And, Keith was very much about artists being treated fairly, artists having total freedom to express themselves, and understanding that at a certain point when, certain things connect and then people are very, want to own the work, there's sharks in the water that sometimes just want to work for speculative reasons as opposed to like, I really get it, I really appreciate this, I want to live with this. And so Keith was obviously, and as artists and our other friends of ours that were artists, we were very aware of these things and were, hypothesize about how we'd best deal with this. And then things were happening very rapidly at that time. And so when it kicked in, it was like, oh wow, here they come. And so Keith was, well, how do I navigate this? And I'm going to make sure, because I can remember in the beginning, he didn't want to paint on canvas because canvas symbolized like a very typical art thing, like stretch the canvas and work on canvas. And Keith was like, okay, I want to try to find another way of doing this. And I remember the store downtown on Christie Street where he bought the tarps from and felt like, and had the little grommets put in so you could just hang it on the wall and felt like that was an alternative. He would later work on canvas, but so it was a way of working with and then working against what that quote unquote established mode of operation was. And then he also had these other balancing acts of wanting, this was inspired by Klaus Oldenburg, who had set up a store in the East Village in the 60s where things could be very accessible, at the same time understanding that, when things are going through the galleries, they can become quite inflated. And Keith wanted to maintain a connection with that real person on the street, with that young black kid, with that young Latin kid who lived in the projects. He wanted the work to be accessible to those people as well. And I remember early on him talking about the idea that would later become his pop shop, where he can sell t-shirts and little, cups and, things like that, book covers that average working class people could afford. So it was something that was an ongoing struggle, battle, dealing with it, and
I think the pop shop was, in a way, the perfect counterbalance to his inevitable commercial success. I think it was something that, he was able to it was very radical at the time. I think he was not liked in the quote unquote art world for making it that accessible. I think it was frowned upon for the most part. And now you fast forward to today, and it's very desirable. People like Shepard Fairey and have all these the art component, but they also have the T-shirt and licensing bit.
May I just add something? Because Leo Costelli, one of the dealers, but he actually said in an interview, the pop shop is an art project. And what I always think about is when I was at the Documenta 10 in Kassel, 1997, and there was the project of Hill and a shop selling clothes, and 10 years later, people would have understood and would have seen it as an art project, as they would do today.
I just want to build on that a little bit to say that Collab always did souvenir shops. And we had one that Jenny Holzer and Kiki Smith did at Documenta in '82, I believe. And the Times Square show had a souvenir shop. And the year before, we had done one at Barbara Gladstone at Christmas. Our souvenirs were generally handmade. A guy was like, oh, I think I'll paint skulls on Chinese paper fans. And so they were they weren't done in an organized way. And we were also certainly coming out of the store you were just talking about. I'm blanking on his name. You know, it was coming out of that 60s souvenir thing. But I also wanted... Oldenburg, thank you. I wanted to say Rauschenberg, and I know it was the wrong Berg. I need to take memory pills. What is it? Ginkgo is what I need to be taking. But I also wanted to touch on something that you had said in the gallery about the subway drawings. Two things. One was that I always felt like they were referencing, among other things, chalkboards in schools, because he drew with chalk on these black surfaces. So they very much had this, like, who draws on the chalkboard? The teachers is showing you something. He was trying to, and by bringing chalk instead of a marker, he was less likely to get thrown in jail, because chalk was not a contraband material. It was not a known graffiti material, and it could be smudged off. But he did these as, anonymous commentaries on current events. But then by the time he stopped doing them, they had become commodities. He had become famous. Everyone knew who they were. First we would see them around. Then after a while, people would start going, oh, I just stole one of those. And at first that was funny, but by the end, it was not, it had changed from a statement into a commodity, and it was as if he was stapling dollar bills up in the subway, because so he felt like, if I want to give somebody something, let me give it to them rather than put it up on the wall and have because there were sort of people that were like kind of following him around to take them as soon as he did them, and then try to sell them the next week, and that he wasn't happy with that.
I think that the subway drawings, to me, were more of an art project as opposed to the pop shop. I think the pop shop was something. It wasn't conceptual. It had a purpose. The purpose of it was so that the accessibility, the common man on the street could have these things in reaction to the subway drawings, in a sense that he had to stop doing them.
Yes, but Gil, I see it as an art project, and of course there are references before, but not in the way he did it. That was a totally new thing, and the Hill thing at the Documenta 10 or many other things that came were also different things, because they were really designed shops like a shop, and they were just like a permanent shop, what it brought with it. And I feel that, and that's what I said in galleries, that stopping because of this unpleasantness of people taking the works away, which he just didn't support at all, I see a connection that he opened the pop shop because that was just a way to give, as Freddy said, give to the people who do not have the ability to buy a herring tarp. But on the other hand, it was, as Julia told me, he never really made money with it. And it was really also in the way he designed it, in the way he painted it, everything. It was a project by itself. So that's just my idea about.
Yeah, I also want to just point out that I remember during the time of our close friendship in the early 80s, there were a couple of breakthrough moments for Keith. And so we were hanging out pretty much several days out of the week, just clubs, partying, looking at each other's work in the studio. And Keith was very much attuned to graffiti on the trains, on the walls of New York City at the time, of which it was everywhere. And so it was great myself being like an art nerd, as you can probably know, and being aware of all these painters, I used to cut school and go to the museums across New York, I guess is how a lot of it started. So Keith was a person I could have talks, even when you'd see a wall with layers and layers of tags, of which you couldn't even make out one name. Keith was a person I can say, well, damn, there's something Jackson Pollock in there. There's something like some kind of automatic writing. And he could be like, yeah, and we'd have these intense discussions about these kind of things. And then Keith would be seeing little tags and recognizing names of things that I wouldn't even pay that much attention to. Like, man, I see that guy's tag everywhere, and this one over there. I was like, oh, okay, yeah. But so he really wanted to be a part of that in a way. He so desperately wanted to be a part, but equally he wanted to be a part in a unique way. He didn't want to just be this white guy, because he was very sensitive about that in terms of white privilege, et cetera, just coming in and doing graffiti the way most other kids did graffiti. He wanted to do something more unique. And I remember him hitting me up one day. It's like, oh my God, I think I did it. I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, man, I got to show you this thing. And I went, and it was a wall somewhere. He had tagged this little crawling baby. And I was like, okay, wow, that's cool. And he'd fit it into a little space at the base of a New York street lamp. And I was like, wow. And he was like, yo, and he'd put those little glowing, actually that was the actual Radiant Child that when Rene Ricard wrote a big piece, he was referencing that, this little crawling baby, and it was like, that was a big breakthrough moment. Now Keith had his version of a tag, which he was doing everywhere. Then on top of doing the tag along the lines that would be expanded with the pop shop, he's began to make buttons. These little cheap buttons with the baby that he would have his pockets full of. Everywhere he went, he'd give you a button. So that was a way that everybody could have a piece of it. So that was cool. And then not long after, there was the revelation of one day what would happen in New York when an ad had run its time in the subways or however it was structured. They would just put a black piece of paper there. And Keith one day said, wow, get some chalk and just start drawing. And it was like, there might have been 3 or 4 in some station downtown, and he did these drawings. He was like, oh my God, Fred, I did these drawings, man, you gotta see. I'm like, okay. I was like, wow. So that was another breakthrough, because he'd found a way to really participate in what was going on in the subways, but in a unique space, perfectly framed. So it was just something I wanted to add that I remember vividly, how
Fred,
excited he was.
Do you remember when you saw the first Radiant baby?
Well, yeah, that he showed me one that, like I said, was at the base of a street.
No, but do you remember what year it was? I was trying to remember this.
Oh, Times Square show was 80. It was between 80 and 81. Okay. Yeah.
So that really sort of coincides with Dieter's presentation this morning when he was talking about the evolution of Haring's language pretty tightly. I do want to open it up to our very patient and attentive audience. Thank you for staying with us. I hope you feel it's been worth it. Please ask questions. Since we're recording, I'm going to repeat the question, so if you could keep it succinct, we'd greatly appreciate it. Yes, madam.
Yeah, what do you think was the source of his hope, particularly as the AIDS crisis really spiraled out? And was that, I would say, from listening today, it's probably related to friendship and doing creative work. But
Yes, what was the source of his hope, particularly as the AIDS crisis evolved? I think it was his core circle of friends, but could any of you expand on that?
What's the question?
The source of his hope?
Yes, the source of his hope, yeah.
What was the source of his hope?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I remember when that happened. I mean, at that time in New York, I think, if you were there, it was like people were dying, and it was tragic and sad, and it was quick for a lot of people. And, in the mainstream, in the government, there was nobody really listening. And there were horrendous things being said about where it came from and what it is, and it was just like, what is happening? And the activism in Keith had him attuned with positive voices informative voices speaking out about what was going on, what were killing all these creative people. And as opposed to some people in authority running away from it, Keith ran like towards it with his dukes up, ready to fight, is the way I remember it, because people were terrified. So it was like a fight. And I remember when, the news hit that he was positive and that he was going to go public in a, was that like a Rolling Stone article? It was amazing. I mean, that this guy who was a very good friend of mine was so courageous, because it was a thing a lot of people were ashamed, and it was a heavy, heavy period, and Keith went head on, man, like, I'm gonna lay it out on the line, and I'm gonna fight, and I'm gonna be an example, not one of those people that's trying to hide. I'm gonna let people know, like, this is a fight, which obviously still goes on, and that's how I recall it.
Anybody else want to add to that, Gil? Or?
I think Fred kind of got the full gist of that. I think I'm younger than Keith, so that generation that was born in 58, 57, 60, etc. Those were the guys that really suffered, and so many people were lost, so many amazing creative people that were lost. So in the at the height of whatever it was that they were doing, contributors to the culture at large, and it was devastating. And his hope had a lot to do with the work and the fight to end the sort of prejudices that were so common. Early on, Haitians were considered a high-risk group. It's just like all this nonsense that took place, and again, early days where the president of the United States at the time, never said the word AIDS, well into his presidency, and didn't respond to it.
Next question, please. Here in the front. Yes. Yes, that's you.
Thank you, everyone. This is kind of a silly interesting question, but one of the pieces in there says, like, enough, like one of the subway pieces says enough already. Someone on the left panel is saying enough already.
Haring.
Haring. And I'm wondering, is that someone that he knew, or was that just, like, did people who worked in the format of street art actually communicate with each other throughout the city?
Yes. It was probably a hater. It's probably a hater that was like, enough already, Haring. It was just like...
But hater, I would say when you do projects in public space, you know that people, or you challenge people even to react to what you're writing. And I recall one photography by Kwang Chi of one of the other subway drawings where actually somebody wrote a comment like, yeah, enough is enough. And he would answer that comment with an image, and that guy would answer again.
Yeah.
So, that was even a dialogue. So
that very much stems from the graffiti world, where somebody would put up a beautiful tag on a train, and then somebody would write on top of it, and it was very territorial. That whole graffiti thing was extremely territorial. It was very about the space, and if one line of whatever you were doing were to even cross that line, it was very territorial.
But wouldn't you say that he was less written over than most?
I would say yes, because he had a unique thing that made people go, wow, that's so different, which was a big idea.
It almost made him a civilian. He wasn't really a graffiti artist. He was kind of in the same world, but
Right.
he was kind of a civilian. He kind
Right.
of
He was to a certain extent, but then whenever we had openings at the time, whenever any of us or other people, like the openings at the Fun Gallery, graffiti artists from citywide would come out. And then one of the things that graffiti artists did and probably still do is have these books, which are kind of sketchbooks. We refer to them as black books, where you get tags from other artists that you like. You'd get a tag, a signature, or a little sketch. And so everybody would be doing that, and it would be amazing to see how popular Keith had become among other graffiti people, because they'd be like, oh, that's the guy that does the crawling baby. And they'd want that, and then Keith would give them buttons. So he was a huge fan, and so there was a lot of love going back and forth with that.
And I think they were stolen that fast and that quick in the end, those subway drawings.
Yeah.
So that also kind of took them away pretty fast, if they were not kind of...
I even heard there was somebody putting up black pieces of paper in those spaces
To feed them. To feed the beast, so to speak.
to feed the beast as bait, perfectly
bait.
said. And then Keith would be like, oh, wow, there's a whole station full of them. Let me go and do a whole series of drawings. And that person who I won't mention, I heard about this not long ago, would then come and he had them taped. He'd take them off very carefully. I said,
So
"Hey."
another question, please. From yes, in the front here, madam.
So I was in New York and San Francisco during all of this time, and I would like to know from the people both in the foundation and the artists that we're listening to today, who is carrying on the legacy of Keith Haring today?
The question is, who's carrying on the legacy of Keith Haring today? I think you mean as working artists. Is that the question? Yes.
Yeah, or struggling artists or whatever.
Yeah.
Because it was a very different time then, and studio space was cheap and all of that. So I'm just kind of curious to see if you can tell me from your experience, even anywhere in the world or here, is there anybody who's really
I think that
towards it?
I think there are a couple of examples that I could think of off the top of my head of contemporary people that have taken that torch and taken it and have gone on with it. Keith, in a sense, is one of the godfathers of street art. So people like, I would say, Shepard Fairey. I would say people like Banksy, who make interesting things that are not necessarily what we would deem traditional graffiti. So I think those are two examples of people that have taken the torch and not only just have done it street art-wise, but in commercial ventures as well.
Yeah, I think if you're searching for a real aesthetical followers of him, I would say that's more difficult because he is so unique. But I've met so many artists and many of artists who move from the streets into the galleries. I mean, all of them kind of refer to him and Basquiat, or just him. And so many other artists, also especially artists who did projects in public space in the 90s and afterwards, were very inspired by this project of the subway drawing. So I would say there is a huge crowd of artists, even if you cannot always trace the aesthetics of it, but the strategy, the mechanisms, so many things that inspired them.
Okay, just time for a couple more. One right here, please.
This is mostly a question for Dieter. but,
Yes.
There was at the very end, particularly, there was work where Keith was very angry. There were people being beaten over the head with penises, and there was also then the hope of the angels and the dolphins lifting the angels. But I didn't see that in the exhibit, which is fabulous, by the way. But I wondered if that was a conscious decision to not include that, or whether you thought you needed to screen it to make it more family.
No,
No.
Yeah. So the question, it was more of a statement, and then the question sort of mixed in, had to do with, in this person's observation, the fact that the exhibition seemed to lack images that present anger, I guess, Haring's anger. And so if you could try to address that in some way, Dieter.
But thank you for the compliment about the show, so that you liked it. No, there was no intention to leave out images to make it more family-friendly or kids-friendly. I remember seeing a large Haring show in the 90s. I mean, already in the 80s, friends came with buttons, drawings, and whatever of Haring around. So it was very present. And the idea of that show is really to show the endless political line. That means his political engagement, but also his thoughts about his themes and the importance of the line in relation to this. So the works follow this concept, and I picked the works which I understood as the most powerful ones in regard to that aim. And so it was not about leaving works out, but it was about finding the best works for that show. And by the way, I mean, this is a selection of really part of the best works he did, but there are of course many, many others who are of that quality. I answered your question? Okay.
Okay. One more, maybe from this side. Yes, madam, up there. Yes. So how did Keith Haring develop this sense of balance and focus in culturally? Yes, very important in his work. Anybody like to answer that?
Well, you know, the kind of guy he was is what all I can speak to is that he was very sensitive about other cultures. He saw everything on an equal footing, people especially, and I think that you know, he didn't look at, let's say, something from a culture that one might consider or term primitive or whatever as less than. He was very open to and embracing of those things. And I mean, there's an African tribe, I can't remember the name of the people, that paint very colorfully and with very bold lines. And I remember he had a book and he was like, yo, look at these. And I'm like, wow. And so it was always like an excitement of look at this. And you could see that this was an inspiration as well as other peoples and other cultures. So he was just open to and absorbing of those things that...
Maybe you're referring to the Maasai tribe, and he was very inspired, I think, by their imagery when he made the body paintings of Bill T. Jones and Grace Jones. And
as
so
well
forth.
as Grace, that's right, the body painting thing as well.
May I add just two words? It's respect and humanity.
It's. I find it I'm sorry. I find it interesting that you know you describe the work as sensitive, and that's how you received it. It wasn't always received that way. There was, I guess, a time he did a show in Australia and did what he does. And I think the Aboriginal people from there took quite an offense. I think they kind of looked at it like we've been doing this for, you know, millennia, and here comes this guy, and you guys are, you know, making a big deal about him. So, you know, the way you're receiving it is not necessarily the way it was received by everyone, but he tried to be sensitive, and it was a balancing act.
I just want to add that when I met Keith in 1980, he had these big, wide eyes, and he just had this so excited and intent look all the time. He was hungry to find out as much about the world as he could. And I think as a guy from a small town in Pennsylvania, he was like, oh my God, I'm in this new, you know, I've come to the big city and it has all these people and things to show me. And then also being gay, he was like, already somewhat of an outsider. So he was sensitive and open to marginalization and identified with it, and was hungry to learn from and take inspiration. You know, Fred mentioned Pollock and Rothko, and he was very interested in the fine art world, but his interest didn't stop there. He was like, there's a whole world here, and I want at it as much as I can.
I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you so much, Jade. Thank you all for staying with us through the day. We deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much to our guests who made such energetic contributions. Do please join us in Willsey Court, where Freddy will be playing music. Dieter will be signing copies of the catalogue, as will Julia, and we can talk and share more stories and answer questions. So if you don't mind letting our guests leave first, that would be most appreciated. Thank you so much.